Hello and welcome to the May edition of the Austin Software Co-operatives Meetup. We are going to be reviewing the Democracy Incorporated, Managed Democracy and the Specter of Inverted Totalitarianism by Sheldon Wolin. It was a lengthy book, and it is somewhat academic. He's a political scientist and teaches at Princeton, I believe. Somewhat of a controversial person. The reason why we chose this book is because as a critique of how democracy can be exploited, and cooperatives are essentially democracies at work. So, dig in here. My notes are a little bit different this time. Let's see how this works. So, let's go ahead and it. All right. So, the main concept of the book is a concept called inverted totalitarianism. So there are different ways to describe totalitarianism. One thing, just off the top, totalitarianism can encompass the Nazi regime, the Stalin regime of Russia or USSR, and Mussolini of Italy. So that's fascism and communism, right? So normally those two things are opposed. Something to keep in mind. So totalitarians want to control everything from the bottom to the top. Normally they are created by some type of strong leader, and how that control gets instantiated is different. So there are local variations of totalitarianism. Inverted totalitarianism is going to be a bit different, and it's going to be how Wolin describes exploitation of democracy. The subtitle of the book is Managed Democracy and How It Works, right? So how is it that that's possible? All right, so inverted totalitarianism, it's going to be some type of inclusion of a corporate agenda. Now, fascism oftentimes is described as the combination of corporate interests and the state, so it can be a little confusing. But fascism is going to be top down, more heavily top down, and there's no illusions that are happening in fascism. Yes, I should say no broad illusions. Inverted totalitarianism is not a public policy, and there's a focus on change. It uses another word, dynamism. So there has to be some way of adapting to your environment. Otherwise, the whole regime or the whole project can crumble or fall away if it doesn't adapt. So inverted totalitarianism is kind of more advanced totalitarianism because it includes two keywords that Wolin uses. It includes archaism and dynamism. Archaism, and we're going to I'm just going to skip forward. This book's huge. Archaism is the view that you take things from history and make, you try to restore what was, sacrosanct or good from history in the present, and try to really try to adjust the future as well with, these tenets from the past. What could that be? Well, it can be something like evangelicalism or constitutionalism, the U.S. Constitution. He compares both of those and kind of labels them as fundamentalism. So fundamentalism would fall under archaism in Wolin's jargon. It's he uses that for to say how you manipulate maybe public opinion. He creates how you address things like what he calls these imaginaries. So, and we're going to get more into that. So there are a couple keywords, like I said. Inverted totalitarianism is going to be one key phrase. Superpower is something he uses often, like as far as the American superpower, as different from a traditional superpower. And this all relates to managed democracy. How power is critiqued and how it's established, that's something he's preoccupied with. And then there's this concept of the imaginary. So we have here the political imaginary, the constitutional imaginary, power imaginary, wartime imaginary, counter imaginary. What is that? So it's basically like a narrative. So some type of idea in the public mind that you are establishing as a power, right? So it's a way to control, it's a way to manipulate. I would say, reading through the book, pretty careful about talking about. He uses the word ideology, not so often. He uses it somewhat. He tries to distill it into other concepts that he makes. Imaginary is one of them, right? So it's kind of like ideas. But ideas are powerful, and we're going to get into that. So within the inverted totalitarianism, power is going to be distributed between corporations and government. And then, corporations are going to be the economic power. Government is relying on economic power and imperial identity. Americans don't like it. We don't like the word imperial. Americans kind of don't even really care about the word. They know they don't like it, but they don't really know what it means. But we don't want colonies. That we know that's bad in some way. So that now I'll use a phrase from Noam Chomsky that causes pushback. It makes it to where the populace kind of frowns at it. So we don't want that. We don't want words like in this within inverted totalitarianism. As far as if you're wanting to establish it, you don't want to have pushback. You don't want the average American saying, we're doing back then things, we're having colonies. But we do have some type of imperial identity, and he references a bunch. So within Central America, Philippines, so on and so forth, we've managed to figure out a way to have Americans, and even Puerto Rico, to have Americans think about those territories as not as colonies. And that was through this manipulation. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to try to speed through some of this stuff, and I'm going to try to point back to how this relates to cooperatives, and it really how it relates to how you would exploit a democracy. And there really is two levels. There's kind of like economics, there's macro and micro. Macro is kind of broad across domains, across markets or industries, and micro would be within an industry. Kind of within democracy, there's kind of a macro and a micro as well. So macro is really what he's concerned with here, but I think we can create some, we can draw some abstractions or generalizations for how democracy can be exploited, and I'm going to try to concentrate on that. Get out of this. All right. So I will say that Wolin is kind of, he's a political scientist, which is, some people make a joke and say that that's really a historian. I think it's a historian that cares about game theory or cares about strategy. So he's preoccupied with talking about certain documents within American history that kind of, what did you want to say the quiet parts out loud. So say the things we you know no one reads, right? So there's all types of documents that are out there that's like, wow, I can't believe it, that someone actually said this. This is our public stance about this thing. This document here, CS 68, the report to President Truman, it had all kinds of things about our public relations policy on how you manipulate the demos or the regular person, right? Public relations policy, right? Minimize unfavorable reactions. We're going to call the American expansion, right? So expansionism, which would be where do we have power? We're going to call that containment instead, right? We're going to contain the Soviet expansion, right? Instead of saying it's American expansion. And then we're going to, basically going to cloud the, and this is language that they use inside of the document to the president, to Truman, cloud the Americans' view on our expansionist policies, right? So they use language like saying the Soviets want to enslave everything, right? And this is the idea of the myth. So one of the things Wolin says is a way to control democracy, and that concept that we saw earlier, the imaginary, right? So a way to control the ideas or the narrative is a word that we like to use. The narrative inside people's minds is to have this innocence versus virtue, or good guy versus a bad guy, right? That whole story is a good way to control, an effective way to control the narrative of the populace. And I'll just go ahead and fast forward. A big part of the book is about controlling the ideas in people's minds. So that's going to include the media, and through different techniques of controlling the media, which would be whether it comes from government or it comes from corporate. Public relations. The author Wolin, he quotes Walter Whitman. He talks a lot about public relations and saying that the public needs to be controlled. So that's going to be some type of relationship with the media. You need to have a narrative that the public can accept. I'm going to talk some. So here's something that's shocking. So the author Wolin says democracy is not mutually exclusive with totalitarianism. Right? People become politically disenchanted, and then that turns into failure, and then that turns into fascism. That works. So we, as Americans, we kind of don't think of fascism as some type of like some stage before it. We don't really think about it. But the stage before that is democracy. The stage before that is people in some way coming together, voting for things, discussing things, having consensus and all that, and then it turning into, oh, we failed. Now we need to have the strong leader. So democracy and totalitarianism doesn't really, it's not really at odds. It's really democracy kind of precedes. Right? And it's something from kind of an insight from me. I want to say that comparing, say, the Nazi regime regime or what the author calls inverted totalitarianism is obscene. Saying that we are going down the path of Nazis, that's obscene. It's a thing that kind of people might shut off immediately. One thing about having it be obscene, it lends itself to being uncriticizable. You go down that path because it's such a bad path. So one thing, again, not the Germany, they had a constitution, right? And they overrided it. Now, with the author, with inverted totalitarianism, we're going to see that you actually leverage the Constitution in order to manipulate the public. Right? So let's go into totalitarianism again. You want to, within totalitarianism, there's a systemic whole, right, from bottom to top. Everything supports the regime. Everything's controlled from the top. Within totalitarianism, when the democracy is weak and it fails, like what I said earlier, it turns into totalitarianism. Now let's go down to inverted totalitarianism. It's a managed democracy. Democracy is systemized. It's an interesting insight. So disparate starting points converge. Right? So you have getting moving forward a little bit in the book, you have different things that you would think would be at odds, and then they end up working together. So you have corporate power, oligarchs, so on and so forth, and you have political power. Really, corporate power ends up being the most powerful. These are different starting points. It doesn't start at, say, one strong leader like, say, Hitler was, and then they establish the top-down authoritarianism. It starts from different places, and everyone has a role. And we could see later, we get to it, everyone is self-interested. Definitely, we need to get to that part where we talk about disinterest versus self-interestedness. All right, so inverted totalitarianism, democratic totalizing power at home, military power abroad. There's a concept of, he says, democratic totalizing power. So you can use democracy, have everyone have their buy-in to a subject. Because you had the opportunity to vote, that creates more legitimacy is a word that he uses to the decision, to the outcome. So now it becomes more legitimate. Whereas if it's just totalitarianism, it's really top down and it's in some kind of sense illegitimate. You didn't commit to it. So it's even though you might have to carry it out, you might be part of the implementation, you might not be part of the implementation, kind of illegitimate. Inverted totalitarianism is a little bit more powerful. Within inverted totalitarianism, the citizens have no political participation, or very little. It's really, I'm getting ahead, but it really is relegated, it's pushed off into electoral politics. So you get to vote once a year or what have you, you're done. You're not participating in your democracy, you're not participating in your government. That's the limit. And there are all types of talks about on how elections get managed that make even that limited. So again, the main concept of the book is managed democracy. So inverted totalitarianism uses democracy kind of as a almost like a weapon. Likes the phrase expansionary. Get into it, but you have legitimacy, so that has a certain level of power where people have buy-in. So you have lots of people that have buy-in power, 350 million people. Because it's legitimate, there's some level of buy-in, right? When you have the ability, like, so how do you expand, right? You have your rules, and you want to maybe break your own rules and want to look legitimate, but oftentimes you want to break your own rules. We'll get into it. But the expansion, going into other countries and really harvesting their resources. Right? How do you do that? Well, democracy seems like a very good reason, legitimate reason to expand. So that's something to keep in mind. Democracy, as Americans, we all been, or just I'll just say the West. We think of democracy as the best thing since sliced bread. If you look at it uncritically, it can be used against you to legitimize other things. So we want to make Iraq into a democracy. Okay? We're going to kill 250 to over 1 million people in order to do that. Legitimate. That's kind of his point there. Big part of totalitarianism or inverted totalitarianism is globalizing superpower. Very important. So how do you have a totalitarian country or a state? So think of the Stalin regime, Nazis, Mussolini, and it's like that could never happen here. People would rise up, Americans, we have our guns, fight against government or what have you. We're not going to listen to someone just telling us what to do. We want our freedom and all that stuff. Well, the globalizing superpower has an answer for that. Really, it doesn't come in the form of government. It comes in the form of corporate controlling you, right? So there's a blurring of the home and abroad, and there's a feedback mechanism. We're going to get into it, but really, when we're exporting our way of life, Americans, and we're saying, oh, you should have democracy. Y'all should have free markets. Okay. Markets solve lots of problems. Well, we instantiate that abroad. I'm getting ahead. There's a doctrine where basically when we do anything that has to do with war or some type of diplomacy, that's an external thing, right? We kind of let the government have a freer hand. We give them more leeway. Right? So in war, we kind of relax. Like we definitely don't apply our Constitution and Bill of Rights to foreign entities. Oh no, you know, you don't get all the rights we do. That kind of thing. Well, when we do with globalization, it kind of blurs, and then we start applying whatever that it is that we do foreign, we start applying it internally. Many different authors have said this, where whatever it is that your country does foreign, it's going to come back eventually. So this isn't unique with Wolin. So terrorism helps with this blurring. So, okay, simple idea, surveillance. The CIA used to be, you can only look at stuff abroad. You cannot look at local. And now we know they look at local too. They capture everything. Why? Because the terrorists could be here. So it found its way back. And that always happens. So there's a saying by another author, his name is Frantz Fanon. He says, what is fascism but colonialism applied at home? Lots of people quote that guy. So, all right, and then we have totalitarian inversion. Another aspect of totalitarian inversion is elitism. So, what is elitism? And this is going to, so let's bring it back to cooperatives, and let's bring it back to democracy within the micro. You have what the author says, elitism is the antidote to mass ignorance, right? The elite within regular totalitarianism, they actually create, and I said this before, they actually create the whole regime from top down. Inverted, the elite is actually the product of the regime. They're manufactured. So within cooperatives, within a democracy, in the small, how could that instantiate itself? What he's going to say is that you have the mechanisms of power. So you really have corporate, and corporate wants to exploit resources in an expansionary way, so from other entities, from other countries. And they also want to obviously keep control internally, so on and so forth, right? That whole idea, like, how is it that you're able to do that and be legitimate, right? So how do you do that and be legitimate? You have to have some form of way of managing the democracy. You have to have some form of way of managing the way people vote. And you have to have some form of dealing with how the masses might not know what's best for them. There's always going to be two views. There's going to be the view of the people on the ground or the lowly people or whatever don't know anything, and they're dumb, and they need to be controlled, right? And it's kind of a hostility directed toward them. And then there's the more of the patronizing view of them, more of this is they need to be assisted because they don't know what the real world is really like. Those two views kind of go hand in hand. It's two sides of the same coin. You either have some faith in the average person, or you don't, right? It's a mix, but there's how much faith do you have in the average, right? So democracy is all about describing the faith in the average, really. Right? So you can have direct democracy where you vote on everything, and if it goes into the abyss, so be it. You can have this republicanism, which is top down. You have representatives, and how do you get the smartest people? All right, so we did that. That's chapter 2 and 3. Go ahead and move forward. So we know what totalitarianism is, or inverted totalitarianism is. This chapter here is about terrorism. I'm going to try to go over some of this fast, but there is one thing that's important, I think. I want to get in. So we have, for terrorism, it's really, maybe I'll try to move a little bit forward in the book. There's a concept, so there's this battle between the elites and the common. And the elites want to manage the common in some way. They want the common to think that they have the ability, like it's a democracy and all that. So within inverted totalitarianism, it's kind of a have your cake and eat it too. They wanted the common to have the belief that they're doing something when they really kind of don't. But you need to have their buy-in, so that the whole concept of being legitimate is having the majority's buy-in. Every now and then you need to create or have or harness, right, some reason that the majority comes in and buys into what you want to do. Plenty of ways of describing this. Let's see, different authors will say, getting the name of one author, but never let a crisis go unused, basically, right? Terrorism, so that would be a way of harnessing. So terrorism, what the author Wolin says, how it's harnessed, it's a way of getting the demotivated, demobilized commoner that's relegated to just voting every now and then to have some buy-in. Like, bring it back into, you have this buy-in, now you have legitimacy. Terrorism will let you do that, right? So terrorism is great because it's power without boundaries. The enemy is not spatial or temporal, right? So the terrorist is not in any specific space, and you're never actually going to kill all of them, right? And they're decentralized, and gives the superpower, which is saying that the United States is uh, a way to always be challenging something. So now that allows for legitimacy to be applied to whatever that the superpower wants to do. And that's really a big goal of trying to exploit democracies, is to try to, you need to always have legitimacy. You have way more, if you're going to be totalitarian, it's going to be top down and say just an regular language um, for, let's say, management language for businesses. You're going to have passive resistance, right? Passive resistance is going to be, people aren't going to be really having buy-in, right? You want buy-in, so you want to have people to have something that they hate or whatever, and that's going to be terrorism, and it serves the purpose. Now, here's an important thing. So we have Thomas Hobbes. If you don't know him, he's a philosopher, created, very influential on the founders of the Constitution, so on and so forth. Very influential political philosopher. Has a concept of the state of nature. Let's see if I have this on here. Nope, not here. But basically, Thomas Hobbes says that if you didn't have a government, then everyone would be fighting each other. So the whole concept, the state of nature, is everyone fighting. It's all against all, is what he says. Everyone's fighting each other, and what you have is the government. He calls it the Leviathan. That's what allows people to be apathetic, to not worry about governing, not worry about fighting, or not worry about violence, as far as to create order out of chaos. Go about their own business, what they want to do. They can leave it to the government, which he calls it Leviathan. So it's kind of pick your poison in his view. You have the Leviathan, and it takes away a lot of your rights. But at the same time, you get to do whatever you want. Now, you get to do whatever you want. You're an apathetic citizen, right? So and he says that that's the best thing for a government, is to have citizens who do not care. They are not participatory in their own governance. So Hobbes, knew about democracy. Obviously, democracy is Athenian and Roman and all this stuff. But he's like, we need to go ahead and this is really how governments are established. All right. So one of the things that I think that is important here is the fear and power. So there's this Hobbesian fear when the government exerts power remotely in another country or foreign entity. The local citizens see that power, and then they say, "Ooh, we better act right." Just call that Hobbesian fear, and it makes it so they have this apathy. They don't participate. They also have this fear. They see this power in the foreign arena, so on and so forth, and it kind of works together to make it to where the people are in control. So that's really kind of the limits or the boundaries of a government. It's like what Hobbes says, and it goes hand in hand with this terror and this fear and so on and so forth with the inverted totalitarianism. That's very important to understand for kind of the basis of what Wolin is saying. And a big let's try to bring it back to cooperative. So you'll see Hobbes talk about apathetic citizens. You see this author Tocqueville, who's influential, we could see later if we get to it, influential on Wolfowitz. I'm sorry, that's Tocqueville is influential on another person named Strauss, who's Leo Strauss, who's influential on Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld. They all, you'll see a bunch of these authors, political scientists, and people in think tanks, so on and so forth. They are all about trying to somehow manipulate people, influence people, nudge people, so on and so forth, to be apathetic about political worldview as much as possible. And one of the strategies is the only thing you need to do is vote, and that's it. You don't need to be participating. So with cooperatives, there's a concept within cooperatives. Richard Wolff will talk about. There's multiple levels of cooperatives. There's owners, so everyone who works owns. Then there are managed cooperatives. So not only do they own, but they manage, right? The workers managing. Seems kind of superfluous, right? But that's not the same thing as directed. Not the same thing as directed. You can have cooperatives that, for instance, if there's a factory and it has the same hierarchy, that it used to be a regular owned, like let's say you take an Amazon factory and it's owned by Amazon, and somehow they decided to buy out Amazon from the factory, right? This has happened, right? So they wanted to close the factory down, and the people got together and bought the factory, and they decided to keep creating the widgets that were in the factory. You can have that same hierarchy that stays in place, and if the people don't figure out how to vote for, establish, or what have you, the people that direct, right? So if they aren't actually directing their goals, then they're still exploited in some way. They're not participating in some way. Right? They're just going to work, doing their job, and leaving. 3 levels. Same thing with, and that's applied on the Mac. That's on the micro. On the macro, it looks like it's applied here. So let's get over here. Utopian. What's a utopia? Three keys of utopia. Founders of a utopia, they possess some form of knowledge concerning the right order of society. The utopians also imagine that the utopia is achievable or realizable. And then they also believe that right now is actually the time to implement the utopia. That's a utopia. Now, utopia is normally attributed to Marxists, communists. You all are trying to get to this place where all the workers are happy and own everything or whatever, like everything's a commune, whatever. That's normally the view. Like we've gone through every single evolution of markets or whatever, and we've reached the point to where everything's at some type of equilibrium. That's a utopia normally, and it kind of has a negative connotation, right? So here's Wolin's, and I copied in his view. The new version of utopia, which would be inverted totalitarianism, and he went ahead and grabbed some of these documents that were kind of memorandums and other types of documents to the president, so on and so forth. They're official to like U.S. government documents, what have you. He's saying here that there's a great struggle between, good and evil, destructive totalitarian visions versus freedom and equality. Great struggles over militant visions of class, nation, and race, which promise utopia and delivered misery, have been defeated and discredited, right? So he's saying The people who want a utopia, they've been defeated, right? Now, he's saying, oh, utopia, far from being discredited, it reemerged in those who wield America's power, right? In the opening sentence, the great struggles of the 20th century between liberty and totalitarianism ended, decisive victory for the force of freedom and a single sustainable model, national success, freedom, democracy, and free enterprise, so on and so forth. That single sustainable model embodies the new utopianism and has its own breathless version of totalizing power. So utopias unite people. Right? United States will use this moment of opportunity to extend the benefits of freedom across the globe. We will actively work to bring the hope of democracy, development, free markets, and free trade to every corner of the world. That's our position in the United States. That's what we're trying to do. That being done, and now it's the time, like I said, those 3 points, now we're in a utopia. That narrative we were talking earlier, the imaginaries, the different versions of imaginaries, that's a narrative that allows a democracy to be controlled. Right? Now, another utopian thing, markets. We've had multiple talks and book reviews on the limits of markets, right? Markets can be used, and people believe, to solve everything. Right, so if it doesn't solve it, it's the most pragmatic way to get to the closest efficient way of solving whatever it is in your mind. That's just the view, right? So that's also a utopian view. Get into the Constitution. So I'm going to talk about this. So one of the limits, we might not make it, so we have another 10 minutes. So constitutions are how you describe power, how you organize power, and it's really how you give power. It says, like it says right here, describe the organization of the power, describes its purpose, and it really legitimates the power. That goes hand in hand with the utopian view. That is that's opposing to this concept of totalitarianism, right? Where you have the great leader on the top and they do whatever they want. The inverted view, they have this blocker, these constitutions. Inverted totalitarianism uses the Constitution to have more power. It uses it by expanding it. How does it expand it? Well, one tool was this terrorism in here, but really it's some type of threat. And now you have the legitimating thing, which is the Constitution. So for a democracy, it can be your founding document. It could be your bylaws for a corporation. You have that, which is supposed to limit you. You can actually turn that into something that legitimates what you do. You can exploit it through expansionary techniques. And this is the one of the insights of the book, is that any governing body can exploit democracy by having, and the author's view is that oftentimes will have an expansionary stance, always trying to expand the limit, which the limit is the Constitution. So it goes hand in hand. The Constitution or the rules legitimate you. They give you more power, and you are trying to work against them and make it to where you expand them more. Finding loopholes, you can call it, that kind of thing. All right. So at the same time, I guess one thing just from the book, this reason of state doctrine I was talking earlier, that reason of state, that is it's a rule that says when you are doing something external, war, diplomacy, you have some leniency. You can do more than what's in your constitution, what's in your rules. Now, um, that external free hand now can turn internal, right? So terrorism, oh, it's blurry. It's external and internal. The terrorists can be here too. So you have a vanishing line between foreign and domestic. So what would you do? Let's say that you have rules of competition that were for the external. Let's take a Mondragon. Like they have a rule that says something along the lines of they have to buy the cheapest thing on the market, whether it's external or internal. So you can look at that if you squint like a threat. There's someone out there that can create the widget better than someone in here within our group of cooperatives internal to Mondragon. So we're going to go ahead and go with them, right? They have that rule. That can, if you squint, you can say, well, you have that threat of external. Somehow you can try to start saying internally, if you have a hierarchy, you can start saying, oh, you internally need to be working harder, exploiting yourself, or so on and so forth, possibly. But that would be the method. Blurring it seems like for any organization that's a democracy, it seems like there is some kind of freer hand for the external than there is in the internal, and all you need to do is blur the lines with an external threat in order to exploit the internal. So that's a reoccurring thing. See here, we got 4 minutes because we started. I am going to, so we have the dynamics of the archaic, and that's, I can just say off the top, the archaic is how you bring, this is a paradox, how you bring things to legitimate what you're doing. How do you bring things from the past in order to deal with the future in the present, right? To manipulate the future or address the future in the present. And so you have people you have narratives or people who are really susceptible to that. And then you have the dynamics. You have the people who are always about adjusting. They really don't care about restoring the past and anything like that. So that would be more, let's just say, science, right? Adjusting to whatever it is, technology, creating new things, and just those things seem to be at odds. Inverted totalitarianism harnesses both of those things, plays them against each other, and harnesses them both. So you have the corporations who harness, they are the dynamists. They harness technology and science and create and make technology. They make products out of it. That is used as an excuse to expand, right? Oh, this is such a great thing. He calls it a kind of a soft influence of the external. So you can use that, and it's harnessed. And also it's saying that, okay, we have the elites within the corporate. All elites are, just to simplify it, elites are fit to rule, right? So he goes into talking about Plato, Aristotle, historically, this battle between the elites and the common, and the corporate are the new elites. There's one concept that I really want to get to, and then we can stop. And I'm going to, here we go, right here. Disinterestedness. Disinterestedness doesn't sound interesting. It sounds like someone who doesn't care. But really it means someone who's not self-interested. If you go back to Plato and just historically talking about political science and stuff, there's going to be people, they're saying that the people who are fit to rule or fit to make decisions or so on and so forth, they are making decisions based off of virtue. They're making decisions based off of what's right, ethically, so on and so forth. They're not making decisions based off of money, right? We say self-interest, right? So ascending the ladder. But corporate, money, what have you, right? Disinterestedness. Plato was big on saying public service, they need to be disinterested, obviously, right? That has been blurred. So inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate culture, and they're not disinterested, they're self-interest. Now you have corporate culture, and then to fast forward through all this, you got revolving doors. You have an executive from Merck or Pfizer being the head or the second in command of the FDA, and then revolving, going back and forth. You got people from Citibank going and being the national secretary of Treasury, so on and so forth, going back and forth. And then we're saying, oh, they are, experts within their field. They're the only ones with the skill. They're the only ones with the knowledge. We have to pick them, whatever, right? That whole thing, when you have self-interest, now you have the makings of the new form of this aristocracy where you now don't have this disinterestedness anymore, and you have the opening for the inverted totalitarianism. Now I think about cooperatives. Seems like you can have that same problem. You have the people that need to be voted in a certain space, right? Whether to a committee or what have you, right? If everything isn't direct democracy, if you're bigger and you need to handle things with committees and stuff like a Mondragon, at some point they can have their own interests, self-interest. Of course, the simple one is just career, but there's also money, and that happens wherever. There are people. I worked at a place one time where there was an executive where he decided to use a vendor, that there was some kickbacks happening, and he got fired and sued. But they found out. That same thing obviously can happen in a cooperative, most definitely, right? And that would be a self-interest. Now we have the virtue of being disinterested. This is the word that we want to use, even though in the short term or long term, someone in some office within the cooperative, within the democracy, would make out better if they were self-interested, right? So there's a concept of public service within the cooperative, within any democracy. It can happen to where they can make more money or have a better career or what have you if they were to be self-interested. So that concept, disinterestedness, is important for cooperatives, for any democracy, for cooperatives, and it's how democracy can be exploited. So we're at 8:12. We got pretty far, chapter 8. The next couple of chapters, he talks about elitism a bunch, and that back and forth there goes into the history of the United States, where it seems like within the author's view, Thomas Jefferson was really the only person who cared about democracy. Everybody else was about elitism. It really was a battle of trying to get, how do you manage the majority? Because the majority is just going to mess everything up in their view. So that's where you have electoral politics. You have the Senate having a lot of power, and they were just openly writing about all of this stuff and saying this needs to happen. He describes that the movements were trying to get, just it's sad, but trying to get, with as far as managed democracy, trying to manipulate the demos or the common to be discouraged in participating and the different methods of doing that. So that's how you would manipulate a democracy, is you really would try to get it to where people don't participate. What does that mean? You want, if you're someone that's a manipulator of a democracy, you want to make it to where, number one, all they do is vote. That's it. They're not participating. No consensus, no dialogue, nothing like that. You want them showing up when it's time to vote and disappearing. That is a minimum. Then you want to also manipulate the vote as well, right? So all of these different ways of making the vote less powerful, making it to where there's different offices to where you can't. Essentially, majoritarian rule is discouraged and fought against. Trying to reverse things, so making it seem like whatever it is that the democracy or the demos actually implements through some type of hard fought movements and all this stuff, go ahead and reverse it afterwards, and they can get discouraged. So having the demos be apathetic and discouraged is how you manipulate a democracy. But while having elites and all of this stuff like that. And then, one that I run into all the time is just people just basically think that the common person can't manage themselves in any democracy. They need, so just the legitimacy of elitism, period, is just getting people to internalize that. That goes a long way by itself. So there's a bunch of that. Don't let citizens mobilize. So that traditionally totalitarian regimes actively stop that. Like, you may not assemble, period. Inverted totalitarianism, it's, he talks a lot in chapter 10, 11, 12. He talks a lot about dividing people. So having focus groups, having ways to where you classify people, instead of having people have a natural common interest and organizing based off of that, you want to point out often, so using media or what have you, every single way that people have some type of class, constantly. So it's interesting, but like Wolin would be very, he would, I think he seems like he would be very disappointed in intersectionality, actually. Like saying that everyone has a very specific group on how they get exploited. I think he thinks that that is exactly what the inverted totalitarianism wants. So if they want you to naturally be against each other through class and every other type of identity. So basically manufacturing identities. And he points out where focus groups, think tanks, and so on actually try to manufacture identities, create more of them, so that people can say, I have these self-interests. And so they don't have the common interests. And that's perfect to make people apathetic, and then they don't want to participate. That was a big one. Again, manipulating democracy, all of that. As far as stopping coalitions, that's kind of what would happen. So